Oh man, this new leader Shanks is a bit scary, but I think the best way to go about this is to just play my power card, 9 cost Zoro.
I'll play Shanks, KO your Zoro.
Damn, I guess you just have everything. Wow, okay. No, that's fine. No, you got this one. You're just the better. No, that's fine, man. Don't worry about it.
Oof, it sucks losing the first round, doesn't it? At least I don't have to fight against Shanks. You're playing Shanks too? God damn it. I just practiced this matchup. They just have a response to everything that you play. It's just unwinnable. I'll play Zoro. I'll play Shanks, KO your Zoro.
Damn, really, bro? Oh, okay. No, you have it again. No, you're just the better player. You just draw everything you need every time. Don't worry about it. No, you got this one. GG, man.
Practice. Practice is actually one of the most important skills in this game, but people often just use it as a means for grinding more games rather than actually learning how to improve in the game. In this video, we're going to be looking at how we can effectively practice using 1, 2, or 3 people to get the most out of your time. Now, this guide is a shortened version of an article that is currently on our Patreon, patreon.com/crossai, and the article version of this, of course, is a bit more in-depth than what I'm going to talk about in this video. So if you are curious about this or any of the sorts of guides that me or CrossAI post, I have a Vegapunk one coming very soon with my deck list in it, then make sure to check that out. This is the second video that I'm putting out in the Ultimate One Piece card game guide, the first one being about Lethal. Now, the Lethal guide was actually my very first video on this channel. Feel free to check that out, but there are some things that I think that I did poorly with that video, so don't get too mad at me. This video I'm hoping to make a little bit better, and I want to cover a topic, of course, that people don't necessarily talk about enough in card games: practice. Now, although I'm a One Piece card game YouTuber, I think that this concept can apply to many other card games, as well as even some games that aren't card games necessarily. I can't say for certain that these are the best ways, nor are they the only ways to practice, but they are the ways that work for me, and I think that just sharing these and having people be aware that there are different ways to practice rather than just playing multiple games is just a fun thing to do, and I thought it'd be great to talk about it. Now, before we go into the methods that I think are great for practicing, I first want to talk about why I think that general 1 versus 1 grinding games is not necessarily that good. One very important thing that we need to avoid when we play these kinds of games is to memorize the wrong habits. Now, we might think that a play is good in a certain situation and then keep applying that to different situations, but it might not necessarily be very good in other situations.
Now, in a situation like this, Purple Luffy absolutely can't finish the game because he has 3 attackers to our 3 life. As such, if we put the opponent to 0 life on this turn, then we can almost guarantee finish the game with Perfume Fimidu the next turn. Conversely, if every single factor in this situation was the same except we only had 2 life as the Doflamingo, then there is the chance that we die next turn, and therefore it is something that we need to be careful of. As such, although we have this same situation where the first time just hitting for 15,000 and then hitting again with Perfume Fimmer the next turn might be correct, in a situation where we just have 1 less life, that is no longer the correct choice because there's, of course, the opportunity that we die.
As such, by practicing in an ineffective way, we can reinforce bad habits and then in turn make it so that when we get to our tournament day, we'll be applying these bad habits or misinformation that we've taught ourselves and then end up losing games that we maybe should have won. The important concept when it comes to practicing is to set a goal for yourself. This can be anything from maximizing your early game power so that your game never reaches the late game, or it can be to test out a few cards to see how they feel within the deck. Nonetheless, when you're in this sort of practice session, you're going to want to have a certain goal for the entirety of the session. Take your time to set up a goal within each session, not game, and then choose what you want to develop over the session, because from one game you might just get bad data. From multiple games you start to get a better idea of what's working and what's not necessarily working. This video is going to be separated into 3 sections. This is going to be practicing with 1 player or yourself alone, 2 people as in you and 1 other player, or 3 people as in you, another player, and an observer. I'm going to talk about the merits and demerits of all of these kinds of practice, as well as how I personally do them to sort of optimize the time that I have when I'm free, so that I don't need to rely on there being a certain number of people for me to have to practice. Practicing alone is underrated, but I think it's one of the best ways to level up in the game. While it might seem a bit odd to play against yourself, what playing against yourself allows you to do is to truly understand a matchup from both sides, as well as test certain strategies or scenarios that won't necessarily come up in every single game. Now, as I mentioned, being able to play both sides of the matchup helps you truly understand what the opponent's weaknesses are. Even if you play deck A against deck B 50 times, you won't necessarily know what the opponent's weak moves are, you'll only know what your strong moves are. But a lot of your strong moves will come from capitalizing on the opponent's weak moves. Therefore, by playing the opponent's deck, you'll know that there's certain situations where the opponent actually, for example, doesn't have many counter cards in their hand, or doesn't have very many answers to a certain play that you can do. As such, being able to play both sides helps you really understand when the opponent is vulnerable and then when the other deck should be capitalizing.
Now, to explain this, let's use a real-world example. In the Shanks versus Doflamingo matchup, people tend to think that going second is better. The reason for this is because you can play Lucky Root on 4 to be able to respond to, for example, if the opponent plays Jinbei Weevil. By setting up the Lucky Root earlier than this, you would imagine that this is stronger. However, going first is stronger in this matchup, and the reason actually largely comes down to Yasokbe. Now, of course, if you play Lucky Root, then you can deal with 2 things on the board, but Yasokbe effectively stalls the game so that although the opponent played the Jinbei Weevil, because of course it's your leader effect as well as having the plus 1000 to your leader for the next turn, these cards don't generally attack. As such, it slows down the game long enough for you to be able to establish a new gate safely and to slowly start chipping away at the opponent's board. If you were to go second instead, then Doflamingo, for example, could start to overpower you by playing Peach from turn 2 to play things like Weevil or even Jinbei into Weevil. Now on 5 though, although you can maybe deal with these with the Lucky Root that you played, you won't be able to deal with the Teach, and then the Teach can of course play something like another 4 cost, use the Teach effect, and then leader effect, play another 4 cost. And this just puts too much pressure on the opponent that they can't establish new gate fast enough. As such, actually, by testing out both sides of this matchup, you can understand that the potential for Doflamingo's moves is really strong when he goes first, and doesn't allow for Shanks to be able to play the cards that he wants to when he's going second. Therefore, by testing this on your own and starting to see the strength of this deck as well as the weaknesses of some other decks in certain situations, you can start to evaluate that perhaps going first is better in this matchup.
Another thing that I think is truly valuable is that you can set up custom scenarios. If there's a matchup that you struggle with, it might not necessarily be that you struggle with every single sequence that the opponent can play. It could be that you struggle with just their perfect sequence. As such, if you set up just the opponent's perfect sequence and then play repeatedly with your organic hand against their constructed hand, then you can start to develop a strategy of how to play against that. By keeping the opponent's hand exactly the same, the only variable that's changing is the way that you're playing with your hand and, of course, the cards that you have in your hand. As such, it helps you better identify the strengths and weaknesses of your hand and how you can possibly improve them with some changes either to the way that you play or the way that you build your deck. Now, on this point of setting up custom scenarios, this is actually how I won a recent official Uta Mirror tournament. This is a bit of a weird tournament that I'm not sure if we're going to have in the West. However, it was a tournament where you only played Uta Mirrors 5 in a row, and then if you won, you got about $700 worth of prizing. It was a really interesting tournament, and they've only done it once ever, and me and my brother, we were the ones that tested the decks together. We're the ones who won it. The way that we did this was that we made a very standard Uta list that had the things that we would expect to have, like the normal film package, as well as things like 9 Custodial, which are great in the green mirror. And we just kept playing against the standard Uta list, where we set up the starting hands and moves throughout the game to make sure that they played perfectly every single turn, to see if the deck that we constructed could beat the perfect move of the standard deck. Once we had a deck that could beat the perfect move of the standard deck, we thought that we were ready, and of course, we ended up winning. This is a very obscure tournament, which is why I didn't make a video about it. But if you guys do want to see something about this, then I can make something. I just don't think that people are going to be very interested in it. Now, lastly, one thing that I want to point out, as the One Piece card game uniquely doesn't have a official online client, is that there is the OPTCG sim by Maebatsu. Now, Maebatsu makes this great sim for people who want to practice, but I don't think that you should rely on this tool. Don't get me wrong, excellent tool for trying decks. But I think that it really should just be used for these sort of simple tasks, like checking if your mulligan's good. If you don't like your mulligan multiple times in a row, then that's probably a deck building problem. Using the sim not as actual battle data for how you're going to do in an actual tournament, but rather to see how your deck functions in an isolated environment is very good. I think that the sim is excellent for testing when you don't have the actual cards. I just don't think that it should be the only practice that you do ever, because this will end up getting you into this habit where you're just mindlessly clicking buttons, because clicking buttons is much easier and a lot more stress-free than physically putting down a card. Moving on to 2-player practice. Now, this is the most standard form of practice, as when you play a normal game, you are playing 1 versus 1. The benefit of playing with someone else is that the opponent obviously will have their own strategies and also the predictability of not knowing what's in the opponent's hand. As such, one of the benefits of playing against an opponent is that you get to practice the skill of reading your opponent's hand. By checking the way that they play their games, seeing how they would play against what you would expect them to play, you can start to make an image of what's in their hand. Now, this sort of reading as well as bluffing is actually a very important aspect of the game, and if your goal for the session is to practice these skills, then absolutely do this kind of practice. The method that I propose for most kinds of practice if you're trying to get better at the game is to play open hand. Now, playing open hand might feel a bit weird because obviously if you see what's in your opponent's hand, then you can play around it, but this is good. The reason for this is because by knowing what's in the opponent's hand now, you'll know what could be in the opponent's hand when you go against the deck with a closed hand. Otherwise, you just play a card, the opponent answers it, and then, oh, I guess I just lost, and you waste another 10 minutes until you eventually lose the game. If either player disagrees with one of the moves that the player did, then you can comment on it. That you can ask them why they did that play instead of a different play, and then you talk about it. By talking about which play is optimal, you can eventually come to a consensus about which play you think is better in that specific scenario, and then of course this dialogue helps you putting it to memory and is a great way to analyze your gameplay without just having to throw away the game by making the mistake. I think this is a great way to play the game because you're not only playing the game, but you're also analyzing the game as you play, so it helps you avoid the monotony of just playing cards because you're doing something that's more active. Nonetheless, two-player practice is what you're going to be seeing the most, and I think it is very important. I think especially this open hand method of playing is going to really help you improve at the game, as people are going to be able to point out things that you don't see as the player. Next, let's move on to three-player practice. When you play with an open hand, you obviously have this dialogue of being able to choose the optimal play together, and if you have a closed hand, you obviously get to play around what the opponent could have. As such, having a third player that acts as the observer to watch over certain sides of the game is great, as it lets you play with two players on one side without having to know what the opponent's hand is. Now, this observer can be very casual and just point out or even ask questions like, yo, why did you hit there? Why did you hit with that one or in this order? And then just being able to ask those questions and forcing the player who is actively playing to answer them is great for the player. As every single action that you take in any game needs to have a reason. If they can't explain their reasoning, then they're doing something wrong. The observer doesn't always have to have this sort of very passive or annoying role. They can also have a very active role, like in the two-player open hand discussion. When the player plays a card, you can propose as the observer, why not play this one, because you can play around a certain card. And in this way, you get to talk about certain scenarios, talking about the what ifs if the opponent has certain cards, without knowing for sure if they actually do have that card. The last thing that I want to talk about as a general note on improving is coaching. Now, coaching is a very valuable tool as it helps you speedrun your improvement. You get to, of course, pay a very high level player to teach you how to play the game and then start to approach his level. Now, this is very good because he can teach you certain matchups that you might not be sure about, but the important thing is that he teaches you fundamentals. He should be teaching you why you're doing certain things and not just what you should be doing. If you just know what to be doing in a certain scenario, then you can't apply that to other decks, and as soon as your deck is out of the meta, then you suddenly can't apply the things that you learned, and you're going to have to buy another session of coaching. I think that these what to do sorts of things can be very easily found by just looking at a video. The real benefit of coaching comes from the coach's ability to explain why certain decisions are being made, and then helping you apply that logic into other decks that you're going to use further down the line. As such, the coach needs to be someone who's not just good at playing the game, but really good at explaining the game. Obviously, because I'm on a Japanese yen budget, and Japanese yen is very bad right now, I've never hired a coach myself, but I can say with absolute confidence that people like Jonas Abraham are some of the best thinkers in the game. He's very good at explaining why he thinks certain ways in the game. I recommend finding a coach not by the decks that they play, but rather by the way that they teach and explain concepts. As such, I can only recommend Jonas because he's the only person that I know does coaching and I'm confident in his coaching. But I'm sure that there are many people out there that can coach. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. People don't really talk about practice because people just expect it to be a very simple thing, but I think that it can be optimized just like anything in card games or games in general. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you guys liked and subscribed, maybe shared this with other people that you think might be making these sorts of mistakes over and over again by just grinding games on the sim. And of course, check out the guide on the Patreon if you are a member or are curious about what else I say or the other guides that me and Cross put up, because I think that they're very high quality. Of course, I'll be putting up a Vegapunk guide soon on the Patreon, so if you guys are interested in that, check it out. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Three player practice. Oh my god.